More than 92,000 Americans have died from the coronavirus. A recent article published by the Washington Post says federal officials' handling of the crisis has exposed structural weaknesses within the U.S. government and has led to shifts in public trust in our political leaders. Dan Balz wrote that piece. He is chief correspondent at the Washington Post, covering national politics, the presidency, and Congress. Welcome, Dan. It's good to talk to you again. What are some of the weaknesses with the U.S. government that have been underscored by the pandemic?
Well, I think there are a couple of different things. First of all, there are chronic weaknesses within the government. You can look at some simple things or seemingly simple things like technology. We have antiquated technology in some of the key areas that are trying to supply assistance to Americans who are out of work. The SBA, for example, or the IRS, for example, have antiquated technology. There's another aspect to this, which is that over many years, there has been a squeeze on the spending for domestic discretionary programs. And as a result of that, what happens is that priorities are those things that come of the moment, whereas the structural problems, the structural weaknesses within the government don't get attended to. The head of the Government Accounting Office, the Comptroller General, said one of the most difficult parts of his job is to get people to start thinking about things before they become problems, because once they become problems, it's often too late to deal with it. But government has a very short-term focus on things, and so therefore doesn't move as quickly as possible. Another is that we've created quite complex systems to provide support, particularly in moments like this. Our healthcare system is very complex because it's a combination of government and private industry. That makes it more difficult to provide the kind of healthcare coverage that many Americans need, particularly in a crisis like this. I mean, one of the interesting things is, as I was reporting this piece, a number of people said, look, government is asked to do difficult things. Government is asked to do things that private industry usually can't do. And on everyday things, government often does quite well. But when you get to a moment like this, you realize how much government is stressed and how difficult the challenge is to meet.
So this hollowing out, as you call it, has been happening for years. What has happened in just the last 3 years under the Trump administration?
Well, a couple of things have happened. One is that President Trump came to the presidency having not served in government or in the military. So he did not have any of the direct kind of experience that many past presidents have had in how government operates. That's one thing. The second is his transition turned out to be quite messy. They had spent a lot of time ahead of the election preparing documents and possible people for high-level jobs. And in the week of the election, right after he was elected, they dismissed Chris Christie, the former governor of New Jersey, who had been heading that, and they put it in other hands. So they got off to a difficult start. Another is that the president came to this office with a view that the executive branch was what, as he called it, the deep state, which is to say that it was in one way or another hostile to him rather than something that he would rely on, particularly in a moment like this. And the other thing that I would point out is that this administration has had significant turnover in the political jobs at the high levels of the agencies. We have, in comparison to other governments, we have many, many more political appointees. And when there is turnover with those people, two things happen. One is, again, they're very short-term focused. And two, there's very little historical memory. So it's more difficult, particularly in a moment like this, to get everybody working together the way we should.
Can you just elaborate on that a little bit? Because some people might argue there needs to be a culling of the bureaucracy and that you don't need all the career officials in the various branches to be there because there's just too many layers. What is it that you're saying with respect to specifically what we're seeing right now with this pandemic?
Well, I mean, that's certainly a legitimate criticism of government, that it can become too bloated and too fat and too many layers. And I think that over time, different administrations have tried to deal with that, although it has been many, many years since there's been a serious effort at that. The last one was in the Clinton administration when then Vice President Gore headed something called the Reinventing Government program. But government needs a refresh on a regular basis, and we have not had that in quite some time. So that's one aspect. If you talk to people in the bureaucracy, one of the things that they will say is that they are often frustrated in being able to do the jobs that they want to do by the political appointees. There's often tension between them. And so it's a combination of the kind of thing you're talking about, which is that government can get overlayered and overbloated and needs a refresh, but it also needs leadership. And particularly at a time like this, it needs presidential leadership, it needs vice presidential leadership, and it needs leadership of the people who are heading the agencies that are on the front lines.
So how do we see public trust in the government shift during times like these?
Well, sometimes what we have seen is that when there is a crisis like this, there is a bump up in public trust. I mean, what we've seen over literally half a century is a pretty steady decline in the public trust. The high points were back in the 1960s. It began to go down sometime after that. I think there's no question that Watergate and the Vietnam War contributed to that. There have been some ups and downs during that period. But one of the things that has happened is that in the last 30 or 40 years, and you could mark it with President Reagan's first inaugural address when he famously said, "Government is not the solution, government is the problem." The rhetoric about government has turned increasingly negative over many, many years. Part of this is the conservative argument about limited government. And part of it is people who are running for office claiming to be outsiders and that they're going to go clean up the mess in Washington. But in one way or another, the public has been told time and time again that government isn't competent, that government doesn't work for them, that government wastes their money. And as a result of that, the public puts less faith in government. And when you have less faith in government, it is harder for politicians and political leaders to take some of the steps that they need to do to refresh government, to provide the funding that's needed.
What implications, Dan, do you think the government's response to the pandemic have when voters go to the polls in November?
I think it's too early to know that. There certainly have been some good things that government has done, but this president has drawn a lot of criticism for some of the things that he didn't do early on. And some of the things that didn't happen as the virus was spreading. So I think we're in a moment in which people are going to be judging how well their government responded to this and who's responsible if they feel it didn't respond adequately. One thing we know is that often in a crisis like this, there is a kind of a rally around the president effect. We call it a rally around the flag effect. And a president's approval ratings generally go up. I mean, we saw after 9/11, President George W. Bush's approval ratings go up to 90%. And what happened in this case was President Trump's approval ratings went up a little bit and then began to come back down. What we've seen in the states is that many governors have very high approval ratings, and the president of the United States does not. And so partly what's happened is that there is a part of the population that's making a negative judgment. But we have a campaign to play out yet, and there will be a debate about this. There will be arguments back and forth, and then we'll get a better sense of the degree to which the public is rendering a negative or neutral or positive judgment on President Trump's administration.
More broadly, Dan, could we see any attempts at government reform after this?
Well, I don't know the answer to that. You would say in a situation like this, because of what has been exposed and the inequities that we've seen that have been exposed by this crisis, that yes, that there would be a turn to which people would say we have to make at least some parts of our government more effective. The public health area, for one, for example. But what we often find is that once a crisis like this passes, people forget very quickly and politicians move on and the public moves on. And in talking to a variety of government officials and people in universities who study public administration, they are consistent in one response, and that is that government is not good at preparing for the next crisis. They are much better at dealing with what is before them at the moment. But there is very little incentive and therefore very little reward in the short term for taking some of the hard steps and frankly for asking some of the sacrifices or the funding that might be needed to shore up that kind of governmental infrastructure. So you would say that something that is as big and as cataclysmic as this pandemic has been, that it would spur people to act in that way. But I think from past experience, we have to be a little bit skeptical that this alone will do it. It's going to take leadership to really pull that about.
All right, Dan Balz for us. Dan, very good to see you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.